In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Agate. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. As a gray, it can be very close to the pencil tone that I prefer, and it shades decently, but not as well as the gray that I tend to go to more often. It has this thing, depending on the pen and paper you choose, where it can be too light on the page at times, which means you need to watch out for your pen and paper that you choose to use it on. Now, in general, that might not be a problem if you're very consistent and always using the same pens and paper. I switch up a lot, and with that, having to really make sure and check my notes on what worked well together tends to be a little bit of a problem. I'm not a fan of having to use ink in specific pens or on specific papers to get its best performance. I can deal with being very good. I did find a number of papers where what was coming out was much lighter than I would prefer, missing the pencil tone, but also turning back to it a couple days later, having to really kind of pay extra attention as I was reading, was more than I wanted to deal with. So this particular ink as a gray is dark enough you can read, but also light enough you might have to work harder to read than you want. So I'm not a huge fan, although I don't hate this. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Duke 209 with a Fude nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine has no feather, no spread. It's offering some shading, quite a bit throughout it. The thing is, it's just very light on the page, and with it being very light on the page, the shading comes through very nice. It's the lighter parts that I find some difficulty with. Now, this pen on this paper gave me a very dark tone. It had no feather, no spread, and it did offer quite a bit of shading, but the tone itself I find much darker than I would prefer my gray inks to be. It kind of looks like a black ink that's underperforming. In this broad, though, the tone is good. The shading is very good. It has no feather, no spread. It is definitely on right here with this pen. We see that in however, we get the dark to light to dark. There we get dark to light to dark to light. It's very nice. This broad gives me the writing that looks the way I want it to look. The back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor My First pen with a medium fine nib. A Pierre Cardin President with a medium nib. A Nimicine Fission with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We only get some spots of shading, really very little. The dot of the I in including or the letter G in including are darker than the rest of the word. In 10, we see the N is darker than the rest of the word, so it does have some shading that's available, just not really tons of it. It could be better. The medium is in general darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. The shading is pretty good here, but also kind of inconsistent. You see how dark the word the is, but if you look directly underneath, invention gets to have some of that nice shading. So it's a little inconsistent in some of its behaviors on this paper. The pen wasn't sitting for very long before it started writing, just from the last writing sample, so I don't think there should have been that much in the feed. The broad has no feather, no spread, good shading. The tone is just a little bit darker than it was with the fine, a little bit lighter than what we in general see with the medium. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. The fine has no feather, no spread. It does shade, and it is too light in general for me to be happy with looking at it. I can read it, but I have to look a little bit harder than I would prefer on this particular paper. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, better shading than we were getting on the Leuchtterm. It's really being much more consistent in its behavior here. No individual super dark words, nothing super light, great tone all the way through. The broad is about the same tone that we're seeing with the medium, with no feather, no spread, but we're getting less shading than we got with the medium. It's still shading, but certainly quite a bit less than we get with the medium. When you see 10th, starts as dark to light to dark, but when I'm saying dark at this point, it's going mid-tone to light to mid-tone. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine, we get no feather, no spread, very little shading. It is there, it's just little hints of it throughout, like when you see the word Arabian. The A to R is a bit darker, the bottom of the B is a little bit darker, but I wouldn't call the shading here very much. It's much lighter. This is the lightest tone that we're getting on this paper in general. So this ink is not a great performer here because of its tone. The medium is a little darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, better shading than we got on the fine. It really does look nice if overall all of it could be a little bit darker. Now it's coming through a little bit darker on camera, and I'm going to try and have it corrected in post to look exactly like what my eye sees. The broad is about the same tone as the medium, maybe a tad bit lighter in general, with no feather, no spread, some decent shading throughout, really light peppering throughout it. I think this tone is perfectly good on this paper. This to me is the nicest one of the three with this particular paper. Looking at the back of the page, we do get the normal light amount of ghosting and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Gray. Here is Geherbon Stormy Gray. Here is Noodler's Lexington Gray. Here is Pilot Scotch Mist. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine, we get no feather, no spread, decent shading. I think this looks very nice on this paper. So if you're a student using this type of notebook, it looks really good and it looks like pencil on here. So very nice. The medium is just a tad bit darker than the fine. I prefer the fine's tone on this paper. The medium has no feathering, no spread, so it's doing very well on inexpensive paper. It does give me some shading throughout, which I'm enjoying quite a bit. Again, this paper for this ink I think is really good. The broad has no feather, no spread, the least amount of shading on the paper at all. it kind of loses a bit of its character here and is a little less interesting. Not to say that it's bad, just less interesting. Looking at the back of the page, we have a normal amount of ghosting for this paper and no bleed through touching the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Colorverse, their Season 1 Saturn V. Here's a blue-black ink by Platinum, blue-black. Here's a turquoise ink by Pelikan, their Edelstein Aquamarine, the 2016 Ink of the Year. Here's a red ink by Robert Oster, their Crimson. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine, we get a tiny bit of feathering. If you look at the P in Paisan, you get it. The H in Scholar, L in Scholar, A in Scholar. It's got a lot of little feathers. Not something to hold against the ink. It's because of the paper. It doesn't really have spread on this Japanese medium fine. It is giving some shading, which is not common for on this paper, so anytime it does happen, it's a bonus. The medium looks about the same tone as the fine, with feathers all over it. They're tiny, but they are there. They're not something to stop someone using this paper. It does experience some spread, getting a bit wider than that medium, but I don't know about all the way to a broad. Its shading does occur, but only in a few spots, and the shade that's nice that's coming through is kind of being overshadowed by the feathering. The broad has a tiny bit darker tone than the medium, with feathering, as we would expect. It does have the slightest bit of spread, but nowhere near what happened in the medium. And the shading, there is some. Again, the feathers destroy it. The back of the page shows us that we have normal ghosting and no bleed through. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.